Spotlight is proudly sponsored by HEC Media, St. Louis's home for arts, education, and culture.
You could call it America's first great conspiracy, but at this moment, America doesn't yet exist.
He becomes more exceptional the more you study it.
This painting where they're showing all of the founding fathers signing this document, that's not what happened on July 4th.
Today on Spotlight, we celebrate the 4th of July with stories about our founding fathers. From George Washington's political rise to a nonfiction novel about a plot to murder him. And then great inventor Ben Franklin and what he was like at a young age. But first, the St. Louis Symphony dedicates a song to the crew and families of the USS St. Louis. It's Sunday and you're watching the Emmy Award-winning Spotlight. Visit slso.org to see more from the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. George Washington was a military general, political leader, and founding father of the United States.
There are things in the Constitution that we think we know the meaning of, but frankly, if you were the first person to be president, you would have wondered.
In an illuminating new biography, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, renowned historian and author David O. Stewart examines the period in his life when he was a soldier, then reinvents himself and goes into politics.
The whole game is about humanizing Washington. He's such a marble figure to us. And he was very human and very accessible. And this was a way I found to see him at more human scale.
I'd love to know, why George Washington? There's so many presidents to choose from. Why did you pick Washington?
Well, I had done 3 books set in the founding era. It seemed to me that I was sort of missing the point. I mean, they were all interesting subjects to me, writing the Constitution, Aaron Burr, James Madison. But, that the central player was Washington, and that I really ought to spend some time thinking about him and his role, which is this wonderful lyric in Miranda's Hamilton musical, where Jefferson and Madison sort of mournfully sing, "Wouldn't it be great to have Washington on our side?" And he captures the fact that if Washington wanted something to happen for basically our first 20 years as a nation, it happened. And part of that was because he made it happen, but also he had such immense stature. And I wanted to carve into that and understand better how he made that happen. There was this wonderful statistic. I'm not the first person to notice it, but had 4 key elections. He was elected commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. He was elected president twice, of course, and he won them all. But he won them unanimously. And even in the 18th century, that was pretty unusual. You know, you don't get that with box tops. Somebody knows the game.
Even later in the book, when I was reading about how, he's president and they have to figure out what is a president? What does he do? How many times does he go out a week? Can you talk about that? Like, where did you find out that was a great part of it?
Well, a lot of it was done through correspondence, which we do have. Thank God they wrote letters. And everybody saved a letter if it came from George Washington. And it was a habit he developed after his first military experience, which was to ask people for advice. You see it as he becomes a political figure. You see it when he is head of the Continental Army, and then definitely into his presidency. He wants to hear from smart people about what to do. He doesn't have false pride in his own knowledge and judgment. He was very modest about his education and intellect. And, as president, he has these 2 warring giants, Jefferson and Hamilton, throwing rocks at each other at every cabinet meeting. And Washington thought that was terrific because he was getting both sides of every issue. And he liked that. And he wanted to know. Now, he always made up his own mind. And a lot of times he did not do what he'd been advised to do. But that consultative style, when he had the time, he always tried to apply that once he was no longer young and foolish.
You could call it America's first great conspiracy, but at this moment, America doesn't yet exist.
It started with a footnote Meltzer noticed almost a decade ago and just couldn't let go.
And I was like, is that real? Is that nonsense on the internet? What is it? 5 years went by, I'm still thinking of this thing. I'd find myself, just checking it out, seeing what's about. And when 5 years go by and you have an idea, it means it's time to do the idea.
But it wasn't that easy. After all, it was a secret plot that Washington eventually discovers and hangs one of the co-conspirators in front of a large crowd to send a message. But that happens just days before the biggest day in our nation's history, July 4th, 1776. Talk about getting overshadowed. Experts warned Meltzer it would be a tough book to write. He and co-author Josh Mensch's research was only that until a certain discovery.
So when we got that, I was like, okay, the whole thing kind of cracked open.
When you started on this journey, you had authors saying, this is going to be a hard one. I don't know if you want to, because a lot of it was secret.
Right. It's not something that we've really read about in anything that's modern. And I went to Pulitzer Prize-winning author Joseph Ellis, who wrote one of the great Washington biographies. And I said to him, do you know this story? What do you think? And he said, this is a story about Washington's spies. And he said, right now you can find exactly how many slaves George Washington owned. You'll never find all his spies. He said, by its nature, what you're going to be searching for, Brad, will forever be elusive. And he said, but you got to try. Because if it works, you get a book out of it. If not, you have an adventure. And I love having an adventure.
At any point during that, did you say, this has been a great adventure? I don't think we got a book here. Or was there a piece of information that you're like, okay,
yeah,
now
the
we can
one,
do it?
in the beginning, I was like, I don't know if we're going to find anything. Because it was something that I'd never heard about, and it was clearly so kind of buried. And the key breakthrough for me is when we found, well, one of the things that George Washington did is he started a secret committee to look at this plot. And he put John Jay in charge of it, who became the first Supreme Court justice. But at this time, he's just working for George Washington in this small committee. And they're knocking on doors, they're pulling people out of their houses in the middle of the night, they're checking suspects and interrogating them. But what they're really doing in the process is they're building America's first counterintelligence agency. And to this day, in Virginia, in Langley, at CIA headquarters, there's a room dedicated to John Jay, the founding father, they call him, of counterintelligence. And the breakthrough came when we found the transcripts of the secret committee's tribunal. And this was the key moment, right? Because George Washington doesn't write about it. He barely says a word about it. On the day that he hanged the man in front of 20,000 people, barely mentions it. If I murdered someone in front of 20,000 people, I'd be like, dear diary, had a bad day, right? George Washington plays his cards so close to the vest, barely says a word. But John Jay and the secret committee, when they tried this man, there were witnesses called, there were people brought to testify, sworn under oath, and thankfully, there was someone writing a full transcript.
It's so interesting. It's a great book in that you know what happens, obviously. We all know what happened with history, but you read it with anticipation of wondering how it all happens, right?
And there's things you just never would ever know. Like, one of the things that I loved is finding out that George Washington had his own personal bodyguards, and that he went to all of his top officers and he said, give me your 4 best men. He wanted what they call drilled men, the best of the absolute best. And one of the things he did is he personally, George Washington himself, narrowed down to about 50 men. Like, these were the inner circle, these were the ones he trusted, the best of the very best. And they were called the General's Guard, they were called the Commander's Guard, but the name that stuck, well, they called them the Life Guards, because one of the things they watched was George Washington's life. They were literally the guards of his life. And these were the men who turned on George Washington.
Scan the QR code on your screen to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
We've got some funny ideas when it comes to Benjamin Franklin.
A penny saved is a penny earned.
The Franklin we know best was wise, inventive, and old. But what about Ben Franklin, the teenager?
He seems to have been about 5'10" or 5'11" tall, which means that he was probably about 4 or 5 inches taller than the average at the time. And he was strong. We know he was a very keen swimmer. There are some references to the fact that he had boxed when he was a young man.
Sure, he would go on to invent things like bifocals and swim fins, and shock the world with his discoveries about electricity. But Ben Franklin was also impressive as a young man. Was he a likable person?
He had enormous presence. I think when Franklin came into the room, he was the kind of person everybody would notice. I don't think he would necessarily try to dominate the room, but you couldn't miss him. And as soon as you started to hear him talk about the things he knew about, which was a great deal, you would soon see just what a powerful intellect he had.
You see, the smart tube reaches the bottom.
Now we can all learn something about the man we think we know, thanks to a new book about the young man we hardly know, Young Benjamin Franklin, The Birth of Ingenuity. Do you think he had an exceptional mind and exceptional intellect, or was he just somebody who just really applied himself?
Oh, he was definitely exceptional. In fact, he becomes more exceptional the more you study him.
Ben Franklin as a child and a father before he became a founding father.
Let's get this party started with Benjamin Franklin.
What Franklin had a great knack for was that not only could he do the physical work of experimentation, he was a very good observer and also very good at designing apparatus, but he also was very, very good at logically analyzing what he saw. He had a very rigorous, very methodical brain, and so he was able to take confused results and come up with a very simple, elegant hypothesis for explaining them.
Franklin predates IQ tests.
He gives these accounts in his autobiography about some of the books he read when he was in his teens. It's not always clear exactly which books they were, so you have to ferret about a bit, as I did in the archives and in libraries, to try and determine exactly what that he was reading. And when you see what he was reading, when you identify those sorts of books, you can see they were very sophisticated indeed. For someone at 15 or 16 to be able to work his way through these books and fully understand the arguments, and then when he was in London and he was 18 or 19, actually to produce a philosophical work of his own, which he actually printed and had published, and doing all long before he was 20, that's pretty remarkable.
I suppose his personality was like? Was he a likable person?
He was clearly great fun to be with. He wasn't quite as eloquent, I think, as people imagined him to be. I mean, as he said himself, he wasn't very good at public speaking. He was a very good writer, and he was very good in small groups, but he didn't care for public speaking.
Well, I think a lot of us sort of think of him as contemporaneous with the other founding fathers, but he was older.
He was much older.
He was the sage.
That's absolutely key point. The fact that he was 30 or in some cases 40 years older than the other great heroes of the American Revolutionary period, and much older than Washington, much older than John Adams, much older than Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton. And that meant that he really came from a different era. It's a very important thing to bear in mind that he was actually born when Queen Anne was still on the throne. And when he died in 1719, Napoleon was already 21 and Beethoven was already 21 and the French Revolution had happened. Now that's a huge span of history. The difference between the world of Queen Anne and the world of Robespierre and the French Revolution is really enormous. And Franklin was a man who had his feet in both camps, so to speak. You know, he came out of a kind of 17th century world in some ways, and yet he actually lived to see, as I say, the French Revolution, the Romanticism, all those great movements that paved the way for the 19th century. And that's a huge span of history. And not only that, but he actually understood that it was a huge span of history. He wasn't somebody who, as he got older, thought everything's going to hell in a handbasket, which many of us start to think. He actually was positive and enthusiastic about the future, which is quite hard to do, you know, as you get older, but he certainly did it.
Well, the book is Young Benjamin Franklin. It's fascinating and certainly somebody that we think we know, but maybe there's some things we don't know. We appreciate you being here, Nick Bunker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Learning how to shoot a black powder cannon later on Spotlight.
Most people, when they think about the Declaration of Independence, they think about the handwritten document that's on display in the National Archives, and they have this picture in mind. There's this painting where they're showing all of the founding fathers signing this document. That's not what happened on July 4th.
More than a year after the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, on July 4th, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence to formally announce the creation of a new sovereign nation, the United States of America. That evening, Congress directed John Dunlap, a printer in Philadelphia, to print 200 copies.
And that was sent throughout the colonies to Great Britain, to all of the generals, to let them know that this had happened. One of these copies arrived in Rhode Island, where Solomon Southwick, who was a printer there, printed 29 more copies.
One of these copies, known as the Southwick broadside, is on display at the Washington University Olin Library. These copies were created to squelch rumors running rampant throughout the colonies during the war.
They print them because it's a lot faster than handwriting, and it's also an official document. So these would be read in town squares by ministers or town officials. So you have somebody with an official standing reading this official document so they can say, this is what's real, this is the true news, not these rumors that you've been hearing.
The handwritten signed Declaration of Independence on display in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. wasn't created until after the broadside copies were distributed, with the earliest signatures made on August 2nd, 1776. Unlike this written version on parchment paper, the broadside copies, printed on laid paper, were not intended to last.
This is a very ephemeral document. Broadsides are printed only on one side, which is why it's called a broadside, and they were usually hung in a town square, on a church door, somewhere like that, and then tossed away. Once everybody knew the news, you didn't have to keep them anymore. So we're very lucky that some of these have survived.
How this particular copy survived is a bit of a mystery.
It survived somehow from the 18th century through 1941, where we pick up its history. We know that it had been folded at one point, so it's very possible that somebody folded it up, stuck it in an attic somewhere, and then forgot about it, or passed it down through the generations. And it was bought by the Newman family in 1941, and the Newman family very generously donated the document to us.
The document was donated to Washington University in 2015. On display alongside this historic document is a beloved collection of one of our founding fathers.
Throughout his lifetime, Thomas Jefferson built 3 libraries. The first one was lost in a fire. The second one was sold to the Library of Congress in order to pay his debts. And everybody's probably familiar with that famous line, "I cannot live without books." That had happened after he sold his collection to the Library of Congress, and he's sitting in his empty library saying, I've got to get more books again. And so that's his 3rd library that he collects. After his death, he had a lot of debt again, I think because of the book buying. So they sold that collection. Now, Joseph Coolidge had married Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, and she convinced Joseph Coolidge to buy some of these books back from Jefferson, including one that he had given to him. So he ended up buying this book twice. Eventually, Joseph Coolidge's collection was donated to WashU in 1885. And those books actually went into the circulating collection for the most part, and they were available for circulation, for study, for students to check out and take home. And then in 2010, there was a scholar working on a biography of Ellen Coolidge who realized what had happened, that Joseph Coolidge's library had come to WashU. She called up some of the people here in special collections and said, you might want to check this out. Can you see if some of these are Thomas Jefferson's? And they were able to rescue those from the circulating collection, bring them into special collections. and identify them as Thomas Jefferson's books. Here's his signature. So instead of signing his books in the front of the book like most people did, Thomas Jefferson went to the I signature and put a T in front of it, because in the Latin alphabet there is no J.
To learn more, visit library.wustl.edu.
HEC has been bringing you positive programming and award-winning content for decades. Arts, education, culture, in-depth discussions, films, and more. All in one place, hecmedia.org.
Me, I trusted him.
Me, I loved him.
And me.
214 years after his death, he's one of the hottest founding fathers, thanks in large part to Lin-Manuel Miranda.
What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, an American musical, has many of us looking at the man on the $10 bill a bit differently these days. But what about the other Hamilton in the show, with a smaller role but immense influence on Alexander's life and legacy?
Elizabeth Schuyler, it's a pleasure to meet you.
His wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton.
We had no notion of who Eliza Hamilton really was, other than what we saw in biographies and in the musical, of course. But we were surprised to find a very spunky kind of warrior lady.
That revelation, based on research trips and the analysis of more than 9,000 long letters.
Long letters, yes.
Alexander never takes 5 words to say what he might say in 50 words.
Between Alexander and Eliza Hamilton, their relatives and friends had Stephanie Dray and Laura Kamoie excited, since spunky and warrior-like isn't exactly how Eliza's typically portrayed, even in the musical they both love.
A lot of the characterizations that exist of Eliza often focuses on her as this sort of very sweet, kind of meek, very loyal, saintly wife. We have a different kind of a characterization of Eliza in My Dear Hamilton.
Their book details a formidable founding mother who grew up the daughter of a general, was fiercely committed to America's independence, helped write many of Alexander Hamilton's most influential papers during their loving, yet sometimes complicated marriage, had 8 children, and lived 97 years, rubbing elbows and making her opinion known with history's key players.
You know, there are these letters, documents of his that are written in her hand. Do you feel that she wasn't just taking note, writing down for him? Do you feel that she was intellectually stimulating? Was she questioning things? I mean, in the book, she is.
We know for sure from her own recollections as a much older lady that in recounting the story of Alexander writing George Washington's farewell address, which was a very famous political document at the time, that she told people that she knew that he wrote it because she sat beside him and watched him do it, and that he used her as a sounding board. He wanted to know her reaction to the farewell address as he was writing it. So it does seem in at least that specific instance that we have evidence that she was giving him feedback and advice and that he was taking it. And then when you put that together with finding some documents in her hand and some other pieces of evidence that seem to suggest that she was involved, present, helping to facilitate some of his political relationships, certainly serving as a hostess in political situations, that she was more than just a scribe for him.
Let's talk more about the founding mothers, because I know on your website that you say that you are bringing revolutionary women to life, right? I think I read somewhere that the first signed copy, the advance release copy of My Dear Hamilton, was your 13-year-old daughter wanted it. Is that your daughter?
Yes.
Do you feel it's important, especially for her, to see these strong women in such a pivotal time in our nation's history?
I think it's very important, and not just women, but I think it's very important that it's understood that all kinds of people participated in the securing of our independence and the building of our new nation. And certainly that's the stories of the founding mothers, but it's also the stories of free African American people and enslaved people and Native Americans and people of all classes, and that it was an enterprise that was successful because so many people worked for it and supported it. And that's a legacy we all still share today. Real people need to fight for and vote and, serve the country that we all live in today.
Scan the QR code on your screen to watch all the full-length interviews about our founding fathers, or visit hecmedia.org.
This is Cannon School.
We're doing a safety school for shooting muzzle-loading cannons.
You're gonna ram, you're gonna swab.
We call ourselves artillery. We're just artillerists. That's a word, artillerists.
This is cleaned.
What is the appeal of shooting cannons?
Duh! It goes a big bang and there's lots of smoke.
And it is one of the most exciting things to hear that cannon go off.
When you're reaching in your pocket to get out your earplug and you use hearing aids, don't pull the hearing aids out. I've done that once.
They make sure you understand it. They actually give you a test on the different things that you need to know, because it's the people who think they know what they're doing and they don't. That's when the big messes happen.
Sunday.
You have a crew, and each crew member has a specific job he must do. And it goes bang. Did I mention that?
Sunday.
I don't understand French. I mean, they go through the words in French and I'm like, just tell me what to do.
LeMay.
I told you I wasn't good at French.
We started this school in, I think it was 93, and here we are.
Trust your intuition. If it feels safe, it probably is after all this instruction.
All right, you guys have your tinfoil.
A lot of reenactors. There's reenactor groups all the way up and down the Mississippi. We have a lot of pirates. They're okay. They're okay. They're not really pirates.
You didn't put the charge in, right?
No.
No. They make you run through it dry fire. Then you actually get to do the actual boom.
Search the bar. Stop the bar. Seat the charge. Ram it. Fire! Nice job.
It's just a big group of people who are enjoying time away from the world.
Hold on.
It's a part of history.
Seat the charge.
And that's, I think, is the amazing thing. It's the used to be, because it never will be again.
Next week, at-home screening tests that could help you catch cancer early. Plus, Valerie Patton discusses Greater St. Louis Inc.'s inclusive business solutions. Thanks for watching Spotlight. Join us next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. on KPLR 11.